Welcome to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast, where we are continuing on talking about all things endurance nutrition. In today's episode, we're talking about a popular nutrition strategy that is the train low, compete high principle. Now, what this is a strategy whereby carbohydrate intake is deliberately manipulated in the hopes to improve athletic performance. Training with reduced carbohydrates on board induces metabolic adaptations that may or may not be favourable to endurance performance. There's a lot of research out there, there's some pretty mixed results, so stay tuned while we dig deep into the science. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. It's Loz and Nash, the expert dietitian, and I'm here with Geordie Sullivan. And today we're continuing on with our little endurance series that we're doing. And we're going to be talking about something that might seem a little contradicting given how much we've been harping on about carbohydrates, and more carbohydrates. And that is this principle of train low and compete high. So what this is a carbohydrate periodization. And it's one of the many strategies out there that we can use to try and enhance our adaptations to training. So just to make a note though, this is purely to be done during training. I'm not saying go into an event on a low carb diet, but we're going to break it down. And ultimately what we're going to be talking about is training on low carbohydrates during training and then competing with high carbohydrate intake. But Geordie, welcome back. How are we going?
Yeah, good. That's another good intro, Loz. I keep putting you on the spot and you keep smashing it out of the park.
I feel like you've just got to kind of adapt and overcome, hey?
Yeah, you got to fat adapt, no pun intended. But yeah, it's a cool episode, hey, because we were just saying then offline, I feel like when you read anything to do with endurance nutrition or endurance training, social media, forums, like websites, whatever, you can't go too far until you see people talking about getting fat adapted and the benefits of it and, using low carb, high fat diet. So it'll be a cool episode to go over and just kind of talk about where we're at in the science and then the reality of it when you're actually in there doing the training. So yeah, I think let's just get into it.
Yeah, sure. And, we know that adaptations to our exercise comes from a combination of factors, and largely that is due to our training stimulus. So the duration, the frequency, the intensity of which we're training, but nutrition can have a massive impact in that too. And, we know that nutrition, it's not just about training, it's training and nutrition hand in hand. But yeah, ultimately periodized nutrition is this process where we purposefully and strategically manipulate an athlete's nutrition to hopefully promote different adaptations, which can then optimize performance. But yeah, with what we're going to talk about today, so the train low, compete high, I feel like there's a bit of mixed kind of info out there in terms of, does it actually promote improved performance or is it just a bit of hype? And I think it's an area that we definitely need a lot more kind of consistent studies and research into, but it's still interesting. And any type of strategy that could be out there to possibly enhance our performance, like all for it. But yeah, I guess we'll dig into that today. But just straight off the bat, Geordie, what's your take on it? Because you're obviously quite heavily involved in the endurance space now, and you work with quite a lot of endurance athletes yourself. Have you kind of implemented any of these strategies, or do you know any guys that this works really well for?
Yeah, we do use it a bit. I guess it's really about the context of where they're at. If you're in an out of prep phase, I'm all for it and you can do it, because we use it a lot with combat sport athletes when we're in camp period, but we're not doing it necessarily to become more fat adapted or whatever. We do this periodization, which is very similar to the train low, compete high, purely just to manage calories. You just don't put as many calories in from carbohydrates and whatnot that you do when you're just to control their weight. But when you're with the endurance space, it's very, very popular. A lot of people will want to try it. I find I'm all for it and let them do it, because maybe over time maybe over a long period of time, if you do certain training sessions, and a lot of people will just naturally do training sessions on lower carbohydrates. Say if they're training in the morning, even if they do eat a bit beforehand, you're eventually going to burn that and be in that low carbohydrate state. So maybe over time there are benefits. I think when you're getting ready for a very specific race and you only have a limited amount of time, you got to make the most bang for your buck. I tend to move away from it, because more so I want to focus on the recovery between sessions. And I find that can be impacted if these guys are doing this train low and they're constantly in this state where they're not nourishing their body. I'm not going to say properly, but as adequately as possible for the activity they're doing. But then again, you have the combo and you go, well, what is the goals of it? If, it's very different if you've got an ultra endurance athlete who just wants to run at 40, 50% VO2 max for hours and hours and hours on end, compared to, say, a marathon runner who is working 85, 90% VO2 max and wants to run a PR. They're very, very different nutritional approaches. So I guess it's all very individual, but it definitely does exist. You always come across it when you deal with endurance athletes.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that you just made in terms of training low carb. And I think a lot of athletes, even the research has found, like when they do studies on athletes kind of nutritional behaviors, they always find that they're actually eating relatively low carb, but not on purpose, just because they don't actually realize how much carbohydrates they should be having every day. So in a way, a lot of people probably, without realizing, are in a way training low because they're just simply not eating enough carbohydrates for the work required. Because as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, you could be having up to 8 to 12 grams of carbs per kilogram of your body weight per day for an elite level, high training load type of athlete. And a lot of the studies find that like a kind of a habitual intake is around 5 grams per kilogram of body weight. And obviously, there's a mix of people out there, but because of not being aware of how much carbs we should be having, a lot of people are training low, not on purpose. But I guess, what the train low, compete high is, so that's where we're deliberately manipulating carbohydrate intake in that lead up to an event to promote physiological adaptations to hopefully improve the body's utilization of fuels. So instead of always relying on carbohydrates, we're switching that over to fats. And this is supposed to improve performance. Obviously, the studies are a little bit mixed. But so we're ultimately training with different carbohydrate availabilities to induce metabolic adaptations that may or may not be favorable for performance. So ultimately, the benefits of this type of approach, as we've mentioned, is going to be those enhanced metabolic adaptations to the training stimulus alongside the physical training with changes in gene expression. So this goes quite physiological and really scientific, really. And there's a lot of papers out there you can read if you kind of think this is super interesting. And it impacts us at like the cellular level with enzymes and everything like that to ultimately make our body more efficient at utilizing fat as fuel. Because the longer that we can spare using our body's glycogen stores, the longer we can put off fatigue. So that's kind of the aim of the game here, is for our body to be more efficient at using fat, because fat is a lot more energetically dense than carbohydrates, and we've got a lot of fat in our bodies that can be used for energy. So trying to switch our body's engine from burning fat so that we can spare muscle glycogen for as long as possible. So in a way, we're getting a bit more utilization of all fuel sources as opposed to carbs. And I think a good way, like, I'm not sure if anyone listening has ever seen this graph. It's a great graph. I think I've remembered it from sports nutrition, and it's like, it has the intensities of exercise and it shows you the substrates at which we're burning, and the longer duration you're going, and like a longer VO2 max, your body is utilizing fat more. But at that high intensity, if you're running at like a super high VO2 max, you're going to be burning carbs. But this is where it comes in handy for our endurance events, is because traditionally you are going to be training or going for a really long time at a more moderate pace, which means our body is a bit more efficient at burning fat. But hand it over to you, Geordie.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, right? And this is where I find nutrition science gets really interesting, because the goal of all endurance training, really, in your nutritional and training strategy, is to become more fat adapted. And we know that that happens by just doing the training, but you want to spare that muscle glycogen. Anyone listening that ever hit the wall, it's a terrible feeling. If you hit the wall, which means you've literally depleted not all of your muscle glycogen, that's near on impossible, but you get to like that critical level. It's such a horrible feeling. And like mentally, what you have to do to push through that is so hard. And that's what you're trying to delay in all your nutritional approaches and all your training in general. You're trying to build up your energy systems, increase your thresholds, increase your intolerances, make sure your body has the right fuel to avoid hitting the wall. And it's an interesting concept when we put nutrition in with training and then with all of these principles. When I first went over this and started doing it, it made me really realize that old saying of training is king and nutrition is queen, it is really true. Because at the end of the day, you can get someone with the absolute perfect diet, but if they're not doing the training, like you can't just get someone off the couch and be like, hey, eat this perfect endurance diet, but they never go out running. They never go out running more than like a couple Ks, and then you put them in a half marathon and expect them to win. It's just not how it works. So all of these adaptations that you get, most of them will come through training, right? And the goal with the nutrition is the conversation we have is, okay, how do we optimize and maximize the adaptations that we think are most favorable for whatever performance outcome you want? And this is where this gets really interesting, because in theory, becoming more fat adapted should lead to these better performances. It's just when we see in studies and we look at this in a controlled environment, we just don't necessarily see that in the studies. I'm not saying that it's completely discredited or we shouldn't think about it. It's just that right now we don't see it. And when you're out in the field in practice, it's very mixed, right? Because there are some people who really follow this like to a T and they go, no, I need to get more fat adapted. But I've noticed with those guys that they're very fit, don't get me wrong, and they're super fit. you do notice they lose that top gear. Like if you have to go up hills, I notice this in the trails a lot when I train with guys and guys who are more on that keto side. If we have to go up a hill and really like charge it and put it in fourth gear, you can get up there and almost power hike or just, but if you want to really go and yeet it up there, it's difficult if you haven't eaten properly or you haven't been topping up your carbs and you feel the difference. So it's an interesting area of research, but I think in practice, at least where I'm at and how I interpret all the research right now, is that the benefits probably aren't as great as what we think it is on a metabolic like standpoint. But if in some way you doing this nutritionally helps you mentally or physically train harder and makes you get more hours in and more volume and makes you stick to a training schedule better, I think maybe then that's where we're going to see this benefit. But that's a completely different conversation. So it's a real interesting area where, to me at least, it really highlights the roles of, you know, how important is training and what is the role of nutrition in the adaptation to that training.
Definitely. And yeah, I think again, it comes down to the individual, because with all these approaches or any, I guess, recommendation we give to anyone, it does come down to the individual athlete and how they respond and what their goals are as well. So I think, yeah, it's a great tool to have, but it's like, is it going to be worth the work? And, you know, I guess the added stress of being like, oh crap, I've got to train today on like low carb. But we can break all that down because there's heaps of different ways you can go about it. But yeah, I guess the aim of this is to ultimately increase our body's ability to use fat as fuel and to spare those glycogen stores. So to do this, there are multiple train low methods. So again, training low is like referring to training with low carbohydrate availability, as opposed to what we've been talking about in like carbs all the time. So there's heaps of different strategies which we'll run through, but ultimately they either manipulate our endogenous stores, which if you remember from our last podcast is our internal stores of energy. So that's our muscle and our liver glycogen, or it manipulates our exogenous sources. So that's what we get from that intra-training carbohydrates, which on our last podcast we went pretty deep into. So always providing carbohydrates during your session. So there's a few different methods. I guess, again, this is where it can come down to the individual, like what way is going to work best for my athlete or what's going to suit my training schedule best. Sorry. And there's a few different ones. So we've got twice a day training, we've got carb restriction after exercise, we've got sleep low, train low, we've got fasted training, which probably everyone's favorite. And then we've got following like a low carb, high fat, or that keto type of diet that you were talking about before, which does get quite a lot of heat. And I mean, you got people like Liver King these days. So low carb, high fat keto diets seem to be a bit of a trend as well. But yeah, we can break down all of those. So I guess the first one is twice a day training. So if you've got a heavy training load, you probably are going to be training twice a day anyway. So if that's you, this could be a good way for you to do it. But ultimately, when we train, we're tapping into our muscle glycogen stores. And I think in a previous podcast, I've used that analogy that if you finish training and you don't replenish with carbohydrates after your meal, you're going to go into that second session depleted, which we want to avoid. But in this principle, this is actually what we want to achieve. So you do your first training session, but then after that, you're not having any more carbohydrates. So that coming into that second session, you're going to be at a lower carbohydrate availability and you're going to have less endogenous, so internal, and also exogenous carbohydrates to use. And ultimately, we're going to oxidize more fat as energy. But to be honest, I feel like I would just feel probably a bit pooped going into that second session without carbs on board.
Yeah, it's tough. Like I've done it before where you just don't top up. And even if you just do get decent amount of calories, again, it all comes down to like the intensity of the session, right? Like, especially if you're just doing like a low and slow, you could probably get away with it. Even then, I feel pretty terrible. If I do like a low and slow and I haven't like eaten properly and put like carbs in, you don't have to be loading up heaps of carbs beforehand or smashing heaps during, but you definitely feel it. And again, I think it comes back to that, okay, what's going to put the person in the best position to get the most out of the training? And I think the other important thing, especially with the twice a days, is the recovery. Like we've seen time and time again, what the impact is for like longer duration activity and muscle damage, like creatine kinase. Like how many studies are coming out now showing the relationship between intra-training carbohydrates and reduced creatine kinase? So that's what I always think about when it comes to twice a days. It's like, well, yeah, maybe you can get decent trainings, but like, it's not like a training cycle is just one day that you're doing 2 sessions. You've got multiple days, multiple sessions across that, not only the week, but month. And if not, whatever that little macro cycle is, I think if you're going to be doing this, put yourself in the best position to recover properly so you can get the most out of your training. I'm not so convinced that, doing the train low and the twice a day is the most ideal.
Absolutely. I don't think it would be sustainable either, because if you're finishing that first day not adequately recovered because you haven't been able to nutritionally recover, coming into the second day, you're probably going to be sore, you're going to be fatigued, and you're also going to be in an even greater like low carbohydrate availability. So yeah, I agree. I probably wouldn't recommend that twice a day training. But again, if it fits your schedule or if it's something you find works for you, then could be a good way to go. But I guess the second strategy that we can do for train low is restricting carbohydrates in that post-exercise recovery period. So we all know that protein is our favorite post-workout macronutrient, but for endurance athletes or any athlete, to be honest, we always encourage carbohydrates after a session because it helps to replenish those glycogen stores ready for this next session. But ultimately what this does is it's exactly how it sounds. It's just restricting carbohydrates following exercise. So that means after a workout, you're not going to have your carbs. And we've seen that rates of muscle glycogen synthesis are actually elevated following exercise. And while they're all elevated for, that 24 hours following exercise, it's especially so within, say, 2 to 5 hours after training. So by withholding from carbohydrates for as long as possible, you're not maximizing that glycogen synthesis. And ultimately, you're going to be going into a low state of carbohydrate availability. But again, yeah, a lot of research has highlighted that the effect of carbohydrate manipulation in the recovery phase is still uncertain. So again, it's like, it sounds great in theory, but what's the practical measures here? Are we actually going to get a good outcome for starving yourself of carbohydrates following your exercise?
Yeah, that's a good point too. Like, sounds great in theory, but really I find it's a bit of a gamble. Like, you just roll the dice. Like, don't get me wrong, everything we're saying, we could be completely wrong. Don't get me wrong, but like, it's just as it stands right now, like you said, it's just uncertain. We don't know. And I don't know if I'm very serious about my sport and if I'm serious about getting performance outcomes, not just going out for, training to feel good or whatever, just get in the sun. If I'm serious about getting a good performance outcome, you kind of want to stack the chips in your favor. And it's like you said, right now, it's just like, well, we don't really know. Do you want to stack all those chips on something that you're uncertain about? I definitely wouldn't.
I know. And the more I read this, like obviously I read about it before we did the podcast, but the more now that I speak it out loud, I just think, I mean, I'm never against science, but I'm struggling to be convinced by this approach, like the more we're going into it, I'm like, hold up. I'm not sure how I feel about this.
Yeah, like I agree. But I do think that there are individual differences. I think even looking at lots of different metabolic readings, like when we send athletes off for metabolic testing, there are some people who just seem to have like a natural propensity for being better fat burners. And maybe there is like an individual genetic component to this where some people just perform better on these higher fat diets or the lower carbohydrate because that's just the way their metabolism genetically works out. And if they find themselves in a sport like a longer duration, like ultra endurance event, maybe that does lead to a greater performance for them. I think you just have to be careful when you're trying to like expand this out for the general population or the everyday athletes listening to this, that maybe there are genetic outliers or whatever it is that's causing this for certain athletes to be better or more favorable for. You need to be careful that we're not just dumping that and saying, all athletes or the majority of athletes, 95% of athletes will benefit from this, where right now the science is kind of saying, well, that's probably not the case.
Yeah. And even when you read the studies, some are done on trained individuals, some are done on untrained individuals, some are done on elite level athletes. So it's like, again, people's physiology and their ability to be able to perform the exercises that they're made to do as part of the science, it's going to be different. So it's like, okay, if you are reading something as well, it's like, oh, am I a trained person? Am I a not trained person? Like, how does this relate to me? Because, different outcomes as well.
Yeah. I always think when I have this conversation with, athletes at all levels is like, what's your lowest hanging fruit for you right now? Especially if you're starting or you're more at like the amateur or recreational level, building yourself up, there's probably a lot more other things that you can be doing to get more bang for your buck, like just an overall good caloric intake for one, and then maybe look into what your macronutrient just like distribution is. Make sure you got all of those micronutrients in. Okay, but once you've got all that, like, and you've got your hydration sorted, maybe we can start looking at additional supplements or look at your training nutrition, really start dialing that in. I feel like as you progress and go on and you really, really get dialed in with all of that, you absolutely nail it. And then your level of competition goes up and you go up from a recreational to a pretty serious and then even professional. And then you get to the elite and then even the top of the elite. I can see how this can be very appealing. It's like, I've done everything. Like, what can I possibly do to get a 1%, especially in endurance events and like pretty much all events, but any timed event where 1% is the difference between a few seconds, and a few seconds can be the difference between first and fifth place. I can see how that's appealing. Absolutely give it a go and try it. I always say to people, if you're going to do it, get your lowest hanging fruit out of the way. Make sure you've nailed them. If you are going to try something like this, put some performance and measures around it. So it's not just like you're winging it and going by, oh, I felt okay during that. Yeah, I felt pretty good. Put some performance measures in. If you're doing this for like a 4, 8, 12-week block, measure it and see if it actually does make a difference. Did your times get better? Did your splits get faster? Did you recover better? Put some metrics around to actually give you some concrete answers. Did this actually work for me?
That's really important as well. And yeah, stuff like this, like your carbohydrate periodization, they're not your first priority. Get your carbohydrate intake right in the first place and then start experimenting with this stuff. So I think that's a really good disclaimer for this episode. Yeah, but I guess moving on to the other strategies, we've still got 3 to go. So we've got sleep low, train low, which, to be honest, I think this could be a really good strategy for those of you who like to train in the afternoon or the evening, which is myself. I'm not much of a morning trainer unless I have to. But this one is pretty much an extension on the one we just spoke about, where you restrict carbohydrates in the recovery section. So this is where you train in the afternoon. You're able to have carbohydrates before your training session, but following that training session, you're not consuming carbohydrates in the recovery period, and you're not including carbohydrates again until after training the next morning. So you're ultimately going to sleep with low carbohydrate availability. You're waking up in the morning, you're training, and then after that training session is finished, then you can have your carbohydrates. But in a way, this kind of blends into our next strategy as well with fasted training. So with that sleep low, train low, you have your carbs, you train, you don't have carbs over the night time, so you wake up and you're ultimately training with no exogenous carbohydrates. And then, yeah, that moves into our next strategy, which is fasted carbohydrate training. So I think this is probably going to be one of the most common and easiest to implement, given like how much everybody loves to train fasted. And if you do want to know more about fasting, I would go back and listen to an episode that Jordan and Ryan just did on the TFD Performance podcast, where they go into depth about intermittent fasting. But ultimately here, we're training in the morning without any carbohydrates. So we're following that overnight fast. And we've mentioned it in previous podcasts, but liver glycogen is what our body uses to regulate our blood glucose levels and to keep all of our processes working overnight. So while in theory, our muscle glycogen stores haven't necessarily changed, we'll be tapping into those liver glycogen stores. So we're not going to be having any exogenous carbohydrates as well. So that's like we're not training with additional carbohydrates, therefore training in a low carbohydrate availability state. And you can follow that session with carbs. But yeah, fasted training, break it down a quick few points from that podcast, Geordie.
Yeah, I guess if we're breaking it down, I guess the intermittent fasting podcast, the biggest point that I'll make is that a lot of the benefits, even outside of training, health benefits, the autophagy, everything like that, very promising in mice studies, animal studies, not so much when we translate that to humans. When it comes to the training, again, it comes back to the low hanging fruit. What's your goals? Have you hit all of these other nutritional requirements? Is that session really, really important for you to perform? And from what we see from the studies, if that session is really important for you to perform and to recover from, fasted training may not be the best. But it comes back to the duration. If you're just going to the gym or you're just going for a 30, 45, even an hour long run, you probably don't need to do it. But if you're going out and you're doing some serious training, you're hitting the trails, you're doing a brick session, you're in the pool for a couple of, if you're doing that stuff, then yeah, it's probably going to be beneficial for your overall training cycle to get those carbohydrate or at least fuel properly for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and this is where it's important to be working with your coach or with your dietitian, with your nutritionist, so that you can time these low carb sessions around your training schedule. Because yeah, it's fair enough if you just get up and you're going for a really light run, but if you're getting out there, you're going for a 100k ride, definitely I would not recommend doing that fasted, because what's the point? You're going to have probably a really crap session. You're going to bonk like probably 10Ks in. But yeah, again, it comes around to what's my training schedule like? And again, what are my priorities? But I think moving into one of the last strategies for the train low, compete high is the low carb or following a keto diet. So ultimately, a low carb diet is exactly how it sounds. So it's just not just around training, it's an all day, every day low carbohydrate diet. Sounds awful if you ask me, but there are a lot of studies out there around low carb, high fat, and also the ketogenic diets. But again, the aim of this is that an increased consumption of fat is going to actually enhance our body's ability to use fat as fuel due to the fatty acid availability. And it's the same way in that a habitual high carbohydrate diet intake enhances our body's utilization of carbohydrates. So I guess it goes both ways. And yeah, there's a lot of studies I find with the low carb space. But I just find like at the end of the day, there's no improvements for those low carb studies. Like I quoted one for this, and it says, in none of the studies, however, were any improved performance effects observed. And that's obviously just summarizing one. But what that study was is they did examine the impact of a short-term low carbohydrate, high fat diet, and on 5 days of a low carbohydrate diet. The high fat diet already showed some adaptations to the diet. However, ultimately, there were no performance improvements, and that's the aim of the game. So yes, if our body can adapt, that's great. But if they're not translating into any performance benefits, then kind of what's the point?
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, right? And that Louise Burke study is super famous. And this is a really, really important consideration, is that you need to remember when we're talking about this, we're talking about elite level sport and sport performance, right? And something that a lot of people blur the lines is between this concept of sport performance and health. And we're not saying that sport performance is health. Maybe there are health benefits to be more fat adapted over time, over a lifespan, over the general population. Maybe, I haven't looked into this, maybe there's metabolic advantages for being like that. When it comes to sports performance, is what we're talking about now, consistently shows that there's not any benefit or very, very little benefit to be had to being fat adapted as compared to having a normal, high carb feeding diet when it comes to performance. I think that's something that a lot of people don't talk about because they blur the lines between, they go, no, it's better to be fat adapted, blah, blah, blah. You can get all of this and all of that. Go, yeah, but at the end of the day, does that make me better come race time? Does that make me better when it comes to my competition? Am I putting all of this effort in? Is it going to give me a better result? And then at the end of the day, what we have right now as the study sit, no, it probably won't.
Yeah. And you're not going to get a badge to wear on the day that says, I'm more fat adapted. Like, congratulations, that's awesome. You're probably still not going to win, like at the end of the day, yeah, it's great. But if it doesn't translate across, then I don't know, it's up to you, I suppose. But yeah, I guess they go on to say that first one that I mentioned was, say, short term, but they did it again over a longer period of time. So say 7 weeks. And again, they did find actually that there were improvements with training, but the training effects were much better with the high carbohydrate group. So again, showing that while maybe both of them did have positive effects, that higher carbohydrate intake was superior. So I think, I don't know, you can't argue with the science, really.
Yeah. And I think now that we've kind of wrapped up most of those concepts, something that I found out that was very, very relevant is Sam Impey's work that he did in that famous 2016 paper that he wrote, is the fuel for the work required, right? And it kind of makes sense, is that if you have a high intensity session, you need to fuel it like in a high intensity session. You can absolutely do these train low and lower carbohydrate fueling strategies for sessions that don't require a lot of carbohydrate, like fuel for the work required. It's so true. And we just went through like this whole episode breaking down these different strategies. And that's really just the easiest way to put it. Fuel for the work required. If you need a lot of carbohydrate for that session to perform and to recover as best as you can, put it in. If you don't need it, then it's not necessary to do that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's quite a few, implications of this train low mentality. And I think that's why the fuel for the work required is great. If you're really interested in it, you should definitely go and read it because it's pretty in depth. But I think it really highlights exactly what you just mentioned. But yeah, if you are training low or you feel like, oh crap, yeah, okay, I've committed to this train low period so that I can become more fat adapted, but I'm constantly having to go into these sessions, with low carbohydrate availability until your body does, so to speak, become fat adapted. Your body's going to be like really struggling to kind of create that fuel. You're going to be feeling tired. You're going to be hitting the wall easier. And I think as well, just like the mentality of knowing that you're going into the session not adequately fueled, I know for me is a big thing. And I don't know if it's just because I obviously prioritize this being a dietitian, but like if I don't eat properly before I train, I kind of go into it thinking, I'm probably not going to train very hard tonight, or I'm not going to be able to go for a 1RM because I don't have the fuel. I haven't fueled for the work required. So I think a mental kind of implication of this train low approach is like knowing that you're already kind of not necessarily setting yourself up for failure, but you're going in with like less energy. And if you're someone that's used to traditionally training really high carbohydrate or having, carbohydrates during your sessions, it can be a big change.
I think the mental side of it is massive, right? And I think there's two sides of that coin, right? Like I think if you're going into it and you understand this, not having the carbohydrate on board could really mentally throw you off. I know for a fact on the other side of that coin, I know people who try low carb or keto, and that mentally for them really pushes them. Like I know someone who eats avocados on their runs and they believe that just by doing that helps them out. And having that self-belief does take you a long way. But to be fair, it takes you to a point. It'll take you to a point, and something I've learned very much the hard way in this ultra endurance training that I've been doing is that your nutrition, yes, it fuels the physical, but it absolutely fuels the mental as well. Because your mind is what, after a certain period of time, everything hurts, everything goes. It's really your mind and your coping strategies that pushes you. Yes, you have to be conditioned. Yes, you have to be, your body can be conditioned to do 160 kilometers, but at say after 40 kilometers, everyone's going to be hurting. You just have to have the mental strategies to be able to push your body through that, and knowing that you are conditioned enough to do it. This is where I find like the fueling strategies become really important, because if you slip up on that mental side, it has ramifications for the physical side. And that's something I've been so aware of and talked to so many other athletes, and all of them agree with it. You have to fuel for this mental. And a lot of the times what that means, your brain runs on carbohydrates. It runs on carbohydrates, especially when you get into these 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 plus hour events. You notice instantly, like, yes, there's the carb like mouth rinse that we spoke about last podcast, but putting carbohydrates in, you notice instantly what happens with your mental state, your concentration, your ability to problem solve, to make decisions. So much better. And that translates to better physical outcomes. Yes, okay, just keep going. Do I walk? Do I run? Do I power hike this? Okay, what am I doing with my running gait? Do I change my running gait? All of these things you're constantly thinking about. Very hard to do it when you're in that carb depleted state. So as much as we're talking about, okay, there's actual physical things and a physical outcome of this, doing this properly helps fuel that mental side as well, which is so, if not more important in my opinion of it.
I think that's a really good point. And again, it brings in the fact that, like, yes, there's the physical training, there's the nutrition, but also there's this huge mental game. So it's almost like a love triangle of getting this endurance thing right. And yeah, like, it depends with your events. You know, maybe if you're just doing a sprint trial, you're doing like a half Ironman, you're going to be pushing pretty hard. You're going to be maintaining a really high intensity for the duration of that event. Like, our bodies are not primed to extract fat enough to create energy for that high intensity. If you're maybe doing an ultra and you're kind of just going at a chill pace, or you're at more of a moderate intensity, that's when our body can like really kick into that. Yep, really like efficiently utilizing fats. So again, it comes back to like, okay, what paces are we doing? Like, what are our goals? What type of training am I doing? If I'm just doing sprint tries or Olympic tries, you know, you probably don't necessarily need to be as fat adapted as if you're doing those like 100K runs, or like those slower, more moderate intensity paces where our body has the time to, you know, burn that fat for fuel. Because if you remember that graph, the lower intensity and like longer duration, that's when our body can like really tap into those fat stores, because while it does produce a lot of energy, it is a bit more time consuming. And if we're running max speed, you know, can't breathe, trying to finish our half Ironman, like, our body doesn't have enough time to utilize fat efficiently, and carbohydrates are going to be the one that can be burned really quickly to supply muscles and the brain with energy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think when you look at the top level guys and you look at what they're doing, consistently find that they do follow this more fuel for the work required. And I always find when you talk to them, they all have this story of, you know, I was just pushing and I went through and I got to a certain stage, but there's just certain events I was bonking and not doing well. And really what I found out, what was like we spoke about, the fourth discipline that I was just losing out on, especially when we talk about Ironmans and, you know, 70.3s is the nutrition. Is that I just either didn't get my hydration or sodium, or the other massive one is I just didn't fuel properly with my carbs. And I was just trying to mentally tough this out, where everyone else around me, they were better fueled, and we're all so close in competition that when we all pushed ourselves to that mental and physical brink, it was those guys that had the better nutrition that just seemed to be able to kick and be able to mentally kick longer and keep that intensity up for a bit longer. And so many of them talk about, okay, once I finally got that, it just made me be able to compete with those guys and go back up there and keep pushing the limits. But it's true. Nutrition is absolutely fourth discipline.
It really is. Yeah. Like we said, I think the other time, like watching that sub 7, sub 8, it was actually really nice to hear the commentators and to hear that, like, some of the ex-athletes speak about how important nutrition is, because it's like, yes, obviously you cannot discredit the amount of work that goes into the physical, but if you don't nail the nutrition, you're like almost doing all that commitment to your physical training a disservice, because it really can be the make or break between, like, you know, maybe coming first or coming second at that really top level.
Yeah, and it is important. We say it. Everyone always says that. Everyone hates dietitians saying it, but it's so individual. Like, I always think about hydration and electrolytes, which we'll talk about next one, is like you can have a super high salt sweater and then a really low salt sweater. And the hydration strategy you have for someone who's doing, say, an Ironman is completely different depending on what those two things are. They look so different. It's the same for all of this. And I think with carbohydrates, there are going to be different tolerances. It's not just a hard and fast number. You got to have 10 grams per kilograms. Some people will be able to perform really well on 6 to 8 grams. Some will be, more adapted to low, but I think the one thing that is consistent with all of the research is getting a good amount of carbs in, and then training your gut and getting used to it is going to be advantageous. And then it's just a game of finding out, okay, what type of carbohydrates work best for you? What works for Loz probably won't work for me and probably won't work for the other person. But we all know we've got to follow these principles and just figure out individually, how do they apply to us?
Definitely. So I guess wrapping this one up, first things first, it's super individual. Like whatever, if we've just spoken about doesn't really align with you, or you feel like, no, that's not going to work for me, then that's great. But it's another tool in the toolbox, or it's another way that you can get that 1% once you've nailed, as you said, Geordie, the low hanging fruit. So you prioritize getting enough calories in, getting enough carbs in, recovering between sessions, getting your protein, having rest days, all of these types of things. And then when you start manipulating your carbohydrates is when, give yourself a decent amount of time to say, okay, do I feel better? Am I performing better? I think that was a really great point about setting benchmarks, so that you're not kind of just like a subjective, like, oh, did I feel better today? Or maybe physical, like, what part of my cycle am I in? Maybe this impacted it over how many carbohydrates I had during my session. So I think being in tune and being like a reflective athlete in a way is really good. And it helps you kind of dial in your nutrition and find what strategies work for you, because just because the research says it might be promising, or your favorite triathlete, is like follows a keto diet, doesn't mean it's going to be the right way for you. But yeah, if you want to do the train low, compete high, there's multiple strategies. Find what works best around your schedule. And ultimately, you're pretty much just training with low carbohydrate availability to theoretically improve your body's utilization of fat to spare glycogen during those longer sessions. But I think we can both agree, Geordie, we're probably more on that higher carbohydrate diet train. But, I'm still keen to read all the research, and I hope there's more to come in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as it stands right now, I think the fuel for the work required principle probably stands as the top, but who knows? That's science for you, right? Like maybe it'll change. Maybe it'll change in 10 years' time. We'll look back and go, oh crap, we did this podcast and we were completely wrong. As it is right now, fuel for the work required is your best bet.
Absolutely. Well, how about we schedule in for 10 years' time an update on this podcast?
If we're still doing the podcast in 10 years' time, maybe we've missed the boat on something else, but absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Geordie. And I suppose I'll see you next time for our next episode on electrolytes and fluid.
All right, Loz, thanks again for the chat.
Cheers, Geordie.
And there it is, another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. Train low, compete high is a popular notion in the endurance world, but the effectiveness of these strategies compared to traditional sports nutrition fueling approaches is still up for debate. Hopefully this episode gives you a bit more information to help you make better decisions with your own training. This podcast will be available through the podcast app, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, and if you follow along our socials at @the_flight dietitian, you can see all of the best bits from our podcast episodes. Thanks for listening in, and I'll see you guys for the next episode of the TFD Performance Podcast.